Welcome to another edition of Working with Gen Z. Friends, we're living in a time where we've often heard the phrase that data and information is becoming the new oil. The democratization of information, especially with platforms like social media, where people have a free hand to create content, and it can be a double-edged sword. Simply because there is so much of information floating around today, and if you're a manager, what and how do you make decisions? Because for everything that you want to see and believe, there is probably a counter view to that, and especially this is more relevant for the young Gen Z, where they're continuously on devices, they're continuously being fed their algorithms. The technology has become so much more advanced where they start feeding into you as to what you feel is who you are and your liking, and it starts influencing how we look at things. But in a time when information becomes free, there's also this danger of, okay, are we doing our homework and making the right decision? So this is perhaps just as relevant for a young manager, but even more relevant we think about senior leaders and even political leaders as we think about all the things that are happening in the world. So the question about critical thinking then becomes very, very essential. But how do you develop that? And are we slipping away from that? That is going to be the focus of our topic today. And to help me with that is my guest and an expert, and I'm very, very happy that John has kindly taken the time. So I'm delighted to welcome Sir John Wilson. John, good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Nikhil. Thank you very much. You're very generous.
Thank you, John. And I know it's polling day there, but you've taken the time. So very happy. Let's dive into this. But before we go and do this, could I request just for you to share your very illustrious career, the work that you've done over more than 5 decades? So tell us a little bit about your work, and then we'll go into critical thinking.
Absolutely. Well, I'm 90, nearly 93. In a few weeks' time, I shall be 93. So I'm not still a young man, but I'm very young at heart and I'm still working. I still work about 12 hours a day, some of it during the night. I'm working as a mentor and coach, and I've been doing that for the last 34 years. Before that, I had two basic careers. I intended to have three. I was trained as a farmer. I wanted to be a farmer. I loved the land and I had a certain gift with the land. I was brought up on farms. I spent a lot of my time with farm hands. Very often, people in those days in Dorset in England, people who were illiterate, but they were full of wisdom. And I got a lot of my early thinking, and I can still remember the words of wisdom that I got from them. I got it from these older farm hands. And my whole intention in life, I'd made a decision when I was 7 years old that I had to do certain things for the family. The family had run out of money. It had made money 4 generations before by being clockmakers, but my subsequent predecessors had all been servants of the king. They'd all been in the armed services. And in those days, you had to supply your own money to be a servant, to be an officer. And so the money had run out. So my first job, I thought, was to try and earn some money. My second job was that the Bittleston name was going to run out. We were getting short of Bittlestons. There'd been a lot of girls in the previous generation, and they, of course, changed their names on marriage. So I was determined to have a big family. To earn money, I was going to work as a farmer, as a farm hand initially, because we had no capital, and save enough to buy a farm, small holding, and make a farm out of it. And as I say, I loved the land. I got an agricultural degree. 1 month, just over a month into my farming career as an assistant farm manager, I fell under a bit of farm machinery that was testing. It was an unguarded sledge of 1/2 a ton, and I slipped under it by accident. It was not my fault, it was the sledge's fault as it happened. And I was trapped underneath it and dragged for 400 yards on 4-inch wheat straw, which stripped my back of all its skin. I was extremely lucky. I was in hospital for 18 weeks. I was very, very lucky to live. And my life was actually saved by a nurse who sat with me for 30 hours. We didn't have intensive care in those days. She sat with me and saved my life. 4 years later, I married her. She was my wife. And of course, I couldn't go on farming, and I had to make a decision. Lots of people offered me jobs in the country selling to farmers, but I didn't want to look over the hedge. I wanted to farm. And if I couldn't, I said to myself one day, I will become a city boy. And I took my Hornby train set so that I could sell it for money, got on a train with just enough money for the ticket, nowhere to stay, no one to feed me, no job. And I went to London and I set myself up in London. And within a few days, I'd got a job. And I worked at that job very tentatively for about a year while I looked around and saw what I really wanted to do. I was then very fortunate. Somebody who took an interest in me introduced me to an advertising agency. It happened to be the biggest one in London at the time. We're now in 1952. And I joined the London Press Exchange and I spent 16 years in advertising. I was in two agencies, the LPE for 9 years and the S.H. Benson for 7 years. I had a wonderful time. It was the heyday of advertising in those days, and advertising was a real racket. We were paid 17.65 on the gross billings and no paybacks to clients. So we were both well off and extremely spoiled. At the end of 16 years, I realized I knew quite a bit about advertising, but not a hell of a lot about business. I decided to change from Berkeley Square, where my agency was, to the City of London. And I went from an agency employing 500 people to a company employing 145,000 people, a big flour milling, baking, agriculture, grocery product company, Ranks Hovis McDougall. And I stayed with RHM for the rest of my career. I didn't stay in one job for it. I did a number of jobs. And in 1977, they wanted to develop, my parent company wanted to develop in America. I was fairly senior and I am half American. My mother was American. And they said, would I be part of that? Would I be the senior person in that? And I went and looked at what they were doing and I said, no, I will not. We are not equipped to deal with America. We will make a terrible mistake of it. And I refused to do it, which was a very big decision for me because the chances were there would be nothing else for me to do. They said, oh dear, we don't want to lose you. Will you go to Singapore for a year and get rid of 3 very small businesses we have there? Come back at the end of a year. If you can bring us back 20 or $30 million, that will be marvelous. And we'll have a big job for you in the head office. I didn't like the idea of a big job in the head office, but I did like the idea of a year in Singapore. I came to Singapore, I looked at what we were doing, and I said, I'm not selling this. This is capable of development. And I turned the business, which was really not making any money at the time, into a big business. And I sold it 11 years later for $1 billion. And they were very pleased about that. But they were also a little shattered because they didn't think it was going to be worth anything like that. Yeah. So they said, we have a very handsome pension scheme. You are now 58. We think take advantage of it and good luck for your happy future. Shortly after that time, my wife died and I stayed in Singapore. I'm very happy to be in Singapore. I've been here 47 years now. And it has been a fantastic, unbelievably wonderful place to be. I cannot sell it well enough.
Wow. Thank you again, John. Wow. I know that we've met before, but I hadn't known all the parts of the story from the love for the farm, farmland to your advertising career, and then of course the story about building the business and selling it. And so clearly, you've seen right as we say, the view from the top, the view from the middle, and as you're growing and building the business. So let's talk about, John. We're talking about a very I believe an important and almost an essential skill, which is really impacting, I think, the world at large with all what's going on in the external world and the geopolitical sort of scenario is becoming more and more complex every day. But let's turn the focus more to kind of at the workplace. So we're talking about critical thinking, and I think in our context of Gen Z, I want to first just start by asking that this is a generation which has grown up with technology in their hands. This is a generation which can validate or sort of negate something, in a conversation just by looking at Google. And back in the day when we were in the classroom, to say that, hey, the teacher says something, you would listen to her and go to the library if you had a doubt. But that is done, right? Where you have a device and you can just challenge or question or even add to what they're saying. So first and foremost, help us to understand, what do we mean by critical thinking, and why, in the context of Gen Z, is that becoming is it becoming more and more relevant for everyone, but even for that generation? So two parts to the question. Number one, let's break up and understand critical thinking in its simplest form. And then second is that, why is that an important skill for all managers, but even more so with the Gen Z?
Well, it's good of you to ask me that question, and I have to be a bit difficult for you because I'm going to say Gen Z, as we define it, 14 to 28 age group, actually doesn't exist. The real groups here are 7 to 14 is the very primary group. 14 to 21 is what I call the risk group. That's where they're learning to understand risk. And 21 to 28 is the sort of early maturation group.
Mm-hmm.
I do think they're different groups. I know things are moving so fast that I think to lump all the 14 to 28-year-olds into one group is a bit arbitrary. However, the questions you're asking apply, of course, whatever age you are, especially in the second part of that from the 21 onwards. The home boundaries still vary massively from one group to another. So the disciplines that are being learned, taught, and obeyed are completely different in different places, different households, different levels of society, different levels of education. Discipline is completely unknown to some families now, by my standards. In other families, it's so rigid that it actually destroys people's lives sometimes for years and years. For the undisciplined, adapting is very hard, and their critical thinking is very wild. It's undisciplined. That's what the result of that is. For the disciplined, and the disciplined are the people who've been well educated, who've had a steady home life, a comfortable and a secure home life, a home life that's allowed them to grow up without a lot of destruction on the way. For those people, I think their license now is to change the rules. The critical thinking that is being done by the young, by certainly the second part of the Gen Z group, is to change the rules. They don't, of course, know always what rules they want. They don't know quite what rules to change. But the concept of changing the rules isn't a bad one. Actually, when I was growing up, I caused a lot of trouble with my parents and my father and my stepmother, and I caused a lot of trouble with my teachers. And when I got into work, I caused a lot of trouble with my employers too. I was always on the brink of being fired because I was always trying to change the rules. And certainly in the early days, I had very little idea of what the new rules should be. I have a, I think I have a better idea now, but of course there is always, you have to accept as you get older that you get more conservative in some ways and that you get more appreciative of things than perhaps you were when you were young. That's something we can develop as we go along. So, does that get anywhere near your question, or am I evading the question?
No, it's John. I wanted to double click on a couple of things to your response. Number one, which is you talk about discipline, and you also talk about changing the rules. So tell us a bit more. Are you suggesting, and I'm saying this in the modern context, the sheer pressure to perform, the sheer pressure to deliver, the sheer pressure to, make the street happy. I don't discount the need for discipline, but perhaps the luxury of time has is not available. Maybe one could argue that. So, in a time like this, when you talk about discipline, help us to understand, is that discipline to see every aspect, that's all sides of the coin? Is that what you mean? I just want to understand that first. And the second part, of course, is of change. And are we driving change because we've done the critical thinking, or are we simply wanting to drive change?
We Critical thinking to me is a very simple concept, but it's very much ignored today. Critical thinking is, what do you want to have achieved at the end of it? When people come to me and say I don't, they come to me at all stages, sometimes when they're 16, sometimes when they're 60, and they say I don't know what to do with my life. The first thing I make them do is sit down and write a page or half a page of what they would like to be able to say at the age of 85, what they would like to be able to have achieved. And all those things are valid. Of course, I don't expect them to write a detailed account of everything that's going to happen, nothing like that. But you remember when I was introducing myself, I said I had objectives to bring some money back into the family and to bring some boys back into the family. I also had an objective to earn some property because my predecessors had never, being in the services, had never owned property. And I realized that the time had come when we ought to be a slightly property owning family. So I had those objectives. And I kept those objectives wherever I went, whatever I did. They were the long term objectives. The tactics of that was the strategy of a career. And I think that we are not allowing people the time or the discipline to think about their strategy. It is the worst thing that's happened to us. I can tell you a story about that if you've got a minute to
Yeah,
listen to.
sure, absolutely. Please.
Well, I stayed for some time in my early years, during my teens, with an uncle and aunt. He'd been the number two to Montgomery in North Africa in World War II. And I asked him about Montgomery, who was a general who had mixed visions about him. He wasn't always popular. And I said, "How did you like being number two to Field Marshal Montgomery?" And he said he was a marvelous man, absolutely marvelous. He said he drove us mad before a battle. We went over the plans over and over and over and over again until we were absolutely sick to death of the plans for this damn battle. And then when the battle started, he went to bed and slept and said, "Wake me when we've won or just before we've lost." Now, that's a man who understood strategy. He got the strategy right, but he let his generals do the tactics. And if you think about businesses today, how many of the generals, this is why we have such poor leaders, how many of the generals are fussed with the tactics and forget that they're responsible for the strategy. There are actually very few strategic leaders in the world. And that is one of the problems that the world has. Now, bringing it back to Gen Z, what I think we need to do is to let people realize that they are more than tools on an earth, on a planet's surface. They have an element of creativity about them, an element of creativity about their own lives. They didn't make themselves, somebody else made them. They didn't come as a result of their own molding, but they have a chance to mold themselves. They have a chance to set their objectives, and they have a chance to handle the tactics, not all the time. And some people have really rotten lives and very little opportunity to mold them. But most people have a fair attempt, have a fair chance at making the life that they want. And that's what we're not doing. And I think what we're doing is we're teaching people tactics all the time. And if you only pay attention to tactics, you will end up doing what we've done, which is you will say the only thing that matters in life is money. The only thing that matters is acquisition. Therefore, my life is going to be directed in the tactics to get money and acquisitions to possess things. And in the process, we lose one of the greatest gifts we have, which is the gift of appreciation.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, I think you're you make such a good point. I think that clarity is and as you say very rightly, that perhaps many of us in the working careers don't always have that. I think the focus becomes on the tactics, and that becomes more a means to an end. And therefore, I think it is you're always on the path, and therefore the critical thinking just never happens because you're always addressing the tactics. Um, John, what do we do to a generation which is born into the internet, and therefore, social media algorithms influence all of us today? Why limit it to any one generation? Just as we speak, my son is, watching a concert in Mumbai later today, and he said to me, Dad, I didn't even know about this. I was scrolling on Instagram and it just popped up. And I said, wow, there is a concert. I got to go to it. And just literally within a day, he made a plan. Off they go. They're there now, and he's going to come back. And so my question is twofold. One is, how is social media impacting this generation because of critical thinking, and because there's so much on the device? And so you always have, as I was watching recently with the change of guard in the US with the new president, they did away with what was called the fact-checking mechanism, which was again because of the view that again they're tilting one way in their ideology, and and so the very notion of fact checking itself was declared bias. So then what do you do? So coming back to the question is that when you think about social media for this generation, right, what advice would you have? Should they kind of um, do some homework, right? Just to do some basic critical thinking, right? I don't think it'll be fair for us to think about where they can, ignore and be not on a device or not on social media, right? So that's one question. And second, if you're a manager or a boss, right, you're trying to groom a young person, um, what kind of things might we want to tell them to say that, okay, you know, do this before you come to me before an answer, right? So again, two parts to the question: social media impact, and second, if you're a boss, what guidance do we give when it comes to critical thinking?
Social media, what we're talking about is opportunism. And social media is very opportunistic. And there's nothing wrong with being opportunistic, provided you know where you're heading. The point about it is that if you're opportunistic just to get some unknown destination, you will get into trouble. You will get into all kinds of confusion. Yeah, that's what it is. And so perhaps the way to look at this is to say, what is it you want to be able to say? I really enjoyed. I really loved. You see, life is about happiness. The purpose of life is to be happy. And everybody thinks that happiness, because we've taught them this, they think that happiness is achieved by acquisition. The more cars I have, the more houses I have, the more money I have, the more holidays I have, and so on. I've watched people become immensely rich over short periods, buy themselves an enormous yacht in the Mediterranean, go down there with 16 beautiful nubile ladies, and 3 weeks later they're bored out of their cotton picking minds. And they deserve to be because they haven't thought through what they actually want.
Yeah.
The things that you appreciate in life are the feelings you have, the feelings you have for yourself, but also for other people, the feelings you have as a result of listening to music, of reading books, of seeing sights, of paying visits, of traveling, of meeting people, of thinking about other people, of doing things for other people. And I can tell you that I have done many jobs in my life which I really enjoyed, starting with the farming, advertising I loved, business I loved, but the job I've enjoyed more than any other is being a life coach. And why? Because I see people going away, having made a change in their lives, having helped them to make a change, and I see them going away happy. And there is no check in the world that can beat that. I promise you, there is no check in the world that can beat my view of someone succeeding. It's their effort, it's my help. My nudge has helped them. And that gives me more pleasure than $1 million a day. Wow. Well, I want people to enjoy life. I want people to be really happy. I want them to be really understanding. I'll tell you a funny side issue here. I have no religious faith in the normal sense of the word. I don't believe in the gods that we talk about and so on. And so my view is that when we come to the end of life, we come to the end of life. And that's it. And I have no idea beyond, and I don't think about it too much. But I pray. Excuse me. How can I do that? I don't believe in God. How can I pray? No, I do pray. I pray for people. I pray for people. And I pray for things. And the reason is I want to be able to express something. And I don't mind where it goes. I don't mind whether there's somebody listening. I don't even mind if there isn't a God. I just mind that I am able to enjoy the concept of asking for something sensible, asking for something worthwhile. Lives are, I said earlier, happy. Happiness is what we're working for. Actually, what we're working for is happiness by being fulfilled. It's happiness through fulfillment. And you have to qualify it that way because otherwise it sounds like purely me, what I can get.
Yeah.
It's happiness through fulfillment, and fulfillment is always to do with other people.
Yeah. Yeah. So wow, I think you make this is the reframing, the framing of this is so very important because it's I think all of us are we've fallen prey to that, as you say, you're in the quest of that big house and then the next big house and the next car and the next vacation to the Switzerland and whatever, right? But and perhaps when you step out of that, I think then it brings home a very basic point that okay, what will give me that fulfillment and happiness, which then drives, right? The tactics become easier, as you say, right? And therefore, I think that's often kind of what most of us who are on that corporate treadmill. I think we lose sight of that. Let me ask another question here, John. You're talking about critical thinking. You obviously built a very successful business. You worked with some great organizations in your advertising career. How much of the role of curiosity and a culture of curiosity is essential for critical thinking to thrive, right? It's easy for us to have this chat, but if you've got a boss who says do it my way, or if you've got a board which is breathing down the CEO's neck saying that you know all this experimentation is great, but we have to meet the street expectations and so on, right? So in other words, what's the importance of culture in an organization as you think about building critical thinking in the ecosystem?
I think it's vital, and I think I can tell you, I can illustrate it in something that happened to me. My very
Sure.
first, my very first job in London was a temporary one, but my second job in London was with the largest advertising agency, and they took me on the basis that they had an insoluble problem, and they said if you can solve it in 6 months, we'll keep you. And the insoluble problem was that the market research society, market research people they employed could not solve a problem of finding out attendance at cinemas because sampling the problem was so big that you would actually be taking a poll of every attendance at every cinema. And it was a big, this was pre-television days, and cinema was the pre-television medium.
Yeah.
And I said I would do it. I said I will do it. And what I did was I said we're looking at this the wrong way. We're looking at this as a head counting problem. Actually, what we want to look at it as is what is comparatively the best way for us to buy cinema space.
Mm.
And I decided that I could do that because in every single area of the country there were a little local area with between 4 and 8 cinemas in it. And all we wanted to know was which was the best attended of those cinemas. We didn't care really what the figures were. So I went and I interviewed personally 740 cinema managers up and down the country. And I came back and I plotted it on a map and I said, there you are, there are your cinemas covering all major conurbations, all the major cities. And that's the solution to the problem. And a man called Sir Egbert Cadbury, who was chairman of the Cadbury Fry Empire, and it was one of our clients, really took a shine to it. And he was very impressed by the simplicity of the solution I had and the relative cheapness of doing it. It was, I mean, it cost my time, but that was nothing, I wasn't paid very much. Um, and what was happening here, I was being creative. And I've always said creativity was one of the great achievements of humans, and we don't teach it enough. We are beginning to wonder about whether we're going to retain any creativity in the light of artificial intelligence. And the answer to that is yes, we will. Whether many people will, I don't know. But we will still be able to be creative. What is creativity? Creativity is the ability to perceive relationships. That's the best definition of it I've ever heard. And if you read Koestler's book, The Act of Creation, 1,000 pages, and you sum it up in a sentence, you will come back to that definition. Creativity is the ability to perceive relationships. And what we need to do now is we need to get people working on the business of being creative because it is one of the most rewarding things you can do. Let me tell you a little story, if I may, about some of the older people who come to me. When I say old, you must remember I'm very old. So people over 55 I regard as slightly older, but actually quite children, really. But they come to me between 55, 65, 75, and they say to me, we've been retired by our government department, by our business, and we want to go on working because we think it's going to keep us alive and so on. And the second time they come to see me, they say, actually, I'm coming to see you for one reason. I want to avoid dementia. I've seen some of my colleagues get it, and I want to avoid it. And I say, yes, absolutely. So what am I doing with them? I'm asking them to write about one event in their life that they really enjoyed. It might be an overseas trip, it might be a wedding, it might be a film, it might be a theatre, it might be a game of hockey. It doesn't matter what it is, some event that they really, really enjoyed. And they've talked about many times. They've given a brief summary of it in many situations over a pint of beer or over a cup of tea. And I get them to do this in enormous detail. And they come back to me and I say, no, I need more detail. What happened there? And they say, oh, I can't remember. And I say, it doesn't matter. We're not writing the Bible. We're writing a story. You fill it in, you make it up, you add the bit there. and they come back with a very good story. It's a long story. It's usually usually about 2,500 words, something like that, a long story. And they all say one thing. These people are completely unconnected, so they don't see each other. They all say one thing to me. They all say, I never realized how much I appreciated that event. How much I appreciated that event. Wow. And suddenly their lives are changed. But I have to tell you, this is not a scientific study, Nicol. Please don't take it as that. But two of them independently have said to me, and I remember where I put the car keys. I'm not suggesting this is a cure for Alzheimer's, please, but I am suggesting that gingering up the memory, making the memory work, making an event into a really glorious, happy story is very stimulating because it makes people creative. It makes people be creative.
Yeah. Yeah. John, you mentioned about artificial intelligence. A couple more questions here. One is, everybody's talking about it, and I recall reading that article that you wrote recently. Is AI going to make us obsolete? And I feel as a parent who has a Gen Z, a child who I really think there's everybody's talking about the advantages, and there are clear advantages, and there is. I was reading the CEO of I think it was Microsoft saying that okay, close to 50% or 90% of the work coding will be done by AI. So I see my son where there is some assignment, they just use ChatGPT. So what advice would you have again, more generally, like while we want to avail the positives of AI, how do you sense that it can almost deprive you of your thinking ability in time to come? I mean, I think because you're simply asking, you're taking an answer and you're going with it, right? And someone recently made a very important point on one of the social media platforms. Be careful, it's not you're using AI is using you. You have a brain, please use your brain. So, so, so I'd love to hear, like, okay, what advice would you have for all people who are now becoming overly dependent, it seems, so quickly on AI? How will it diminish the critical thinking?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, you know that I write a thing called the Daily Paradox, not daily. That's the paradox. It isn't daily, but it's called the Daily Paradox. And I write it from time to time, about 2 or 3 times a week. And I use AI, and I use AI to make it absolutely clear what I'm not going to write. That's my rule. Whatever
Mm,
AI comes up with is what I'm not going to write. So I challenge myself by using AI. But AI, of course, is a source of information and misinformation too, of course, on a massive scale. And the answer to your question is, I'm afraid, I think for a great many people, it is going to become like that. What we're in the process of doing, Nicol, and we don't admit it, but we don't. We all know it really. We're in the process of inventing the next species. Our species is becoming redundant. In some ways, you can see it already. People with artificial legs, artificial limbs, and now soon artificial brains. Soon you will be able to download your brain. Very soon you will have an avatar that will live beyond you and will be able to communicate with people. There's no question about that. We are inventing a new species, and we're in the process of doing it, and we don't have an objective. We haven't thought that through, and we have failed in one important respect all the way through our education system. And I do blame the education system for this. We have failed to teach philosophy. You see, what's happened was in the early days, we had religion, and religious beliefs, whether you joined them or not, were actually a very good guide. They gave rules, they gave certain parameters within which you had to operate, and they were a form of discipline, and they were misused, they were abused. Everything's abused at times, but they were quite a good form of discipline. That's rather receded now. People do not, even people who are very religious, tend to do it on Sundays or Fridays and not other days. And so the discipline of religion has disappeared to a large extent. And what we need now is we need a new discipline for the new species. And what should that discipline be? And I think I can sum it up in one word: ears. Now you'll say, why? Why should we all be crying? And the answer is because in the work I do, when people come to me, I've had over 20,000 of them in the last 12 years. When people come to me, I know that I shall really understand them when they cry. And I'm talking about sometimes the very heads of big, big businesses. I'm talking about macho men who play rugger and cricket and all sorts of things. I'm talking about intelligent, educated women. Sooner or later they cry. And what is it they cry about? They cry about loneliness. They cry about the fact that they have nobody, not at home, not at the office, not in the bus, not on the train, nobody with whom they can cry, with whom they can say what they really feel. There's a wonderful film. It's a story, of course, but it's got Hopkins in it about the two popes, the Pope Benedict and the one who's just died, Pope Francis, and how they exchanged. It's a fiction. Don't make a mistake about it, but it's very good.
Yeah.
Because it does actually show you that there are times in life when you really need to let the curtains back, to look out of the window, to have a look and see yourself, where you really need to be honest with yourself and say, I'm not happy. I'm not getting what I want. So what should I be thinking about getting? What should I be thinking about doing? And the thing that we failed to teach is that true happiness only comes from doing things for other people. True happiness never comes from doing things strictly for yourself. It only comes from doing things for other people.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful. I think, John, such a lovely message there. I hope that I think this is something that all our listeners, especially the Gen Z cohort, can kind of appreciate, because I think here's a generation. So much has happened in their short sort of, we hear the term midlife crisis. I think I've heard the term quarter life crisis, just because they've seen wars, they've seen pandemic, they've seen AI revolution. So they've been dealt with a few hands there. But I think at the core, to your point, to the point that we're still the human species, right? What drives us, and what's that larger purpose? I think that is equally important, such an important message. Any final words there, John, just as a way to close out? Any advice for the Gen Z when you think about critical thinking, or to the managers saying that, okay, just one thing that they should do or shouldn't do, just as a way to close?
Yes, I think what they should do is they should make something, create something, invent something that nobody else has done. Doesn't matter whether they've done it somewhere else in the world, they don't know about it, but they see that they cannot find in artificial intelligence, in dictionaries and so on. They can't find it. They should invent something and test it and try it. And it can be I'm not talking about a technological wizardry. Of course, many people will be doing that. That's fine. I'm talking about something quite different. I'm talking about what happens when the leaves on the trees don't get swept up and cleaned up. What happens to people? What happens to life? What happens if the sun becomes too fierce? What happens when the temperature goes over 40 consistently? What happens in situations? Get them to stretch their imaginations and say, what we could do is this. It doesn't matter if it isn't correct. What matters is they're doing it. Stretch the mind. Wonderful, wonderful exercise. Better than all the running and cycling that you can do.
Beautiful. I think on that lovely note, I think I will steal that phrase, stretch the mind. We're increasingly coming in a day and age where our brains are being completely being sort of subservient to the technology. It just seems like big and instead of us taking a real advantage of technology, it seems it's going away where technology will as you say reinvent the human or the species is coming to an end. But it's been one wonderful conversation, John. I am deeply grateful. I think both to give us some very specific tactical answers and even the larger picture of how we look at the work, the career, and professional phase. Because oftentimes they go hand in hand, and I think for as you rightly said, many times when you get to your 50s or 60s, you look back to say that, wow, I wish I had done this. And I think that advice, as you think back from such a long career is so very relevant for all our listeners now and going forward. So, John, thank you once again. I've really enjoyed it. I deeply appreciate once again the time. And I look forward to seeing you again in person in Singapore in one of my future trips.
A great pleasure, Nicol. Great pleasure.
Take care. Have a good day.
Have a good day.